Hey guys, how you doing out there? John Waters, Three Pillars Fitness. I hope you're having an awesome, and it came out weird. I hope you're having an awesome Thursday. I hope you're having an awesome week. All right, so today is the day that we've all been waiting for. As promised, I know a couple of you have asked me about bringing Jeff Vitale back on, and I said I would get to it, and thankfully we were able to make that happen. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and bring him on. I know not many people are watching at this time, but hey, we'll be here when you get here. Hey, how's it going, Jeff?
Good, good. How are you doing, John?
Not too bad at all. Long time no see, sort of.
Our last meeting.
Exactly. So I imagine we'll probably have some people tuning in tonight who are unfamiliar with you. And since I am familiar and maybe some people are, would you mind giving those who aren't the opportunity to get more acquainted with you?
Sure. So, my name is Jeff. My main training or background is a physical therapist, but I'm also an board certified orthopedic clinical specialist. So, my main area of specialty is orthopedic physical therapy, sports performance, and I'm also a certified strength and conditioning specialist through the NSCA. And so I have my own practice called Vitale Therapy and Training. I've been a therapist for 21 years. Yeah, just 21 years now. I've been in the field, around the field of health and fitness for over 25 years. And in my practice, I work with, your average, everyday physical therapy clientele, all the way up to the professional athlete and, Hollywood personality, high performance individuals, and, people of that nature. So I really kind of run the gamut in terms of who I treat and what I treat. I have a background in not only orthopedics, but also neurologic. I've worked with individuals that have brain injuries, stroke, pulmonary issues, cardiac issues. So I pull from a wide variety and varied discipline of background.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's so extensive.
So, and I love talking on all those topics. But my main area of focus for probably the last 15 years has been more performance improvement, orthopedic physical therapy, and training high performance athletes.
Dig it. So out of the things that you've done so far, what's been the most rewarding?
I mean, they're all pretty rewarding in their own respects.
Mhm.
Working with someone who has a brain injury and getting them back to their family and working back to, reintegrating into, life is amazingly rewarding. But also seeing someone that you work with that had a pretty devastating kind of career ending injury and get them back to a point where they didn't think they were going to come back to, and they're performing on, on a huge stage, which was, not to, drop names, but like, thinking of, if you follow the WWE, the wrestler Triple H was someone who massive leg injury, not really sure what his career was going to be like. And, 9 months later, he was, at SummerSlam main event. That was really kind of a cool, one of my first big ventures in taking someone of that profile and taking them from the whole gamut, and then being able to work with him for a number of years afterwards as his strength and conditioning coach.
That's super awesome. I remember being younger and watching Triple H on wrestling, and he was the man. Like I remember like seeing some of his injuries and things like that. And I got to admit, it's pretty impressive to know that I know someone that helped him come back. Like that's awesome.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun working with those guys.
I believe it. What
Yeah.
kind of personalities do they have?
I mean, he is one of the nicest people you'd ever meet. Really generous with his time, with anything he could help you with, and is really interested in kind of like giving back to his fans. He's like the epitome of someone who realizes, like, I'm not going to be here unless these people like me.
Right.
And, the WWE really works on how the guys move up the line is how well they're received by the crowd. Vince doesn't promote somebody or give them a shot at a title belt unless the crowd really likes them. So it's really on them to make themselves shine. So he really is someone who is really always trying to connect with his fan base. And a lot of the guys are like that. Very few guys are like really ego driven. There's some of the really nice guys.
That's awesome. So it's counter to what they show on TV. I mean, I get it. You got to get the ratings up.
Yeah, and it's funny because talking to him, I got very close to him for a long time, and he would often say like the guys and even the girls that are kind of have like the biggest, baddest personalities are like some of the wimpiest, or not necessarily wimpiest, but some of the like quietest kind of introverted people, but their character calls for them to be this extrovert, big shot. So
Right.
it's funny.
That's impressive. That's a crazy internal switch to be able to control.
Exactly.
Right, awesome. So I feel like I've been kind of greedy. Those are questions for me. So let's, I guess, move on to the topic, mobility. So I know that, a lot of us are transitioning now, especially with some of the restrictions being lifted. We're not staying at home, as often as we were. We're starting to get more mobile. And some people are even starting to try to attempt to get back into training, or maybe even enter the training arena for the first time. I myself have noticed that there are some limitations, though. I mean, outside of maybe not having prior experiences, they sometimes lack the ability to get into good positioning, or maybe they have some aches and pains that the average person I work with wouldn't have. And so I'm very excited and interested to see what your take is on that and how mobility can be the solution to that.
Yeah. So, I mean, just like you're saying, if because of our, world situation, it forced a lot of people to work from home with poor work setups. And when you're home, what I found talking to a lot of my clients is that they're actually they move around a lot less when they're home. They're in either smaller quarters because they're not in a big office, and sometimes in the office they have to walk further to get to the bathroom, to get to a meeting, to get to other places. But at home, they're kind of locked in. And so I'm seeing a lot of people that are now, like you said, trying to get back into exercise or just trying to get into more of a routine and get fit. And they're coming up against little nagging injuries, some bigger injuries, and definitely some limitations in their range of motion. And you can see that it's directly related to a lot of these issues related to the effects of sitting for long periods of time. So, bringing it right back to the mobility work is kind of like step one where you want to start with them. And if you're one of those individuals that's watching, that's where you'd really want to begin to ensure that you're going to create a really good platform and a base so that you can start to progress and improve. So, I mean, anytime I work with anybody, but especially athletes, but anybody who's going to be active, and I use the term athlete pretty broadly too, and I'll probably mention this multiple times. Really, everybody's, and if you're moving against gravity and you're moving around, you are performing coordinated movements, and in a very loose way, you are an athlete, just kind of going about your daily business. But if you're actually working out regularly and maybe participating in competitive sport, then you truly are an athlete and you really want some refined movement. So, mobility is a big component of preparing your body and preparing you to be successful in whatever it is you're going to do. So when I work with someone, usually try to explain to them that there are two different things in terms of mobility. There's mobility and there's flexibility, and they're different. And it's important that you know why, and you should care why, because they do impact you differently. And we're going to go through a bunch of topics that John has laid out, that like when you're going to do it, who should be doing it, why do it at all, and what's the difference. So that mobility and the flexibility, they're definitely related. But flexibility is a component of mobility, but mobility, it doesn't always go in both directions necessarily. So, if you're looking at flexibility, basically flexibility is your ability of a muscle to lengthen, right? And even the associated tendon with it, right? So, but mobility takes in a much broader scope, and there's other factors that you want to look at. But basically, mobility is the body's ability to move through a range of motion with control, and being able to move out of that range of motion with control, being able to be injury free and perform the motion smoothly and coordinated. So for mobility, like I said, there's multiple factors. We want the tissue's ability to move. So that muscle and tendon has to be able to stretch and contract, but also the overlying skin. And if you have an injury and there's a lot of inflammation and you have some adhesions, or you had surgery and there's a scar, and that scar has adhered down a lot of the layers of the skin, the fascia and the muscle and the nervous tissue, that's going to create a restriction. So mobility is looking at that whole concept as well. Then you're also looking at the joint, the actual skeletal, the congruency or the articulation of the two joint surfaces, how they move is another factor of mobility. And then your nervous system's ability to relax, to allow a muscle to stretch, and then its ability to communicate with the muscular system to contract the muscle, to return from that stretch position, and to move with coordination and timing. So therefore, like, mobility is really prepping your body to engage in an athletic or a coordinated movement. So that's really what kind of mobility is. So flexibility really is just, or stretching is really just about lengthening the muscle and the tendon. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, and what the benefits of one versus the other, and when you should do one versus the other, and should you be doing either.
Right. So before we go too far down that rabbit hole, there may be some people who are watching who may say, you know what, that sounds fun and that sounds awesome, but why should I care? And does it benefit me?
Right.
So is this something that benefits everyone, or is it limited to, a few people?
No, it really, like you're saying, it benefits everybody, absolutely everyone, regardless of your age and what your activity level is. But like, who will benefit from it? The obvious one is the athletes, like we talked about. And why? It's because they're going to be engaging in very kind of like difficult movements, or highly coordinated movements at varying speeds, reacting to external stimuli, and being able to move their limbs, coordinated movements, reverse direction, change velocities. So if you don't have good mobility, your likelihood of an injury doing some of those movements is going to increase. And you also want to improve your performance. So having that good motion and all those factors we talk about, tissue mobility, nerve mobility, nervous system control, all those things are going to help you. But even an individual who is not engaging in a competitive sport or competition is still going to benefit highly from mobility. And it's because they're also going to be moving their bodies and their limbs through coordinated movements. So take someone who goes to the gym, who technically you could classify as an athlete, but they might not be competing, but they're doing, a very aggressive, very complex coordinated movements. So, you want to have a good amount of mobility and control to decrease your injury risk, to improve your performance, whether it's the bench, a squat, deadlift, or any other movement that you're going to exercise, the ropes, running, whatever it is. You're going to increase your ability to move through a range of motion if you have better mobility. If you're just flexible and you can raise your leg all the way up, to your head, if you don't have those components that we talked about with mobility, the neuromuscular control, the flexibility of the soft tissues, you're not going to be able to access those. You might be able to passively stretch that leg up, but are you going to be able to use that range of motion for any sort of like active purpose? So that's one of the things kind of like to kind of get to first, that mobility is going to allow you to use the range of motion and the flexibility that you've acquired. Flexibility is more of just a static I guess I wouldn't say movement because it's not movement, but it's just a static entity where
Right.
mobility is more dynamic and has more closely relates to the activities that we're going to do on a daily basis. And then taking it a step further, even someone who's not working out, that's just maneuvering through the world, getting in and out of a chair, in and out of a bathtub, in and out of a car, you need to have some prerequisite motion. And the better mobility you have in your joints throughout your body, the less likelihood that you're going to have injuries and you're going to lose your functional mobility. So I think it's even really important that older individuals do mobility work, really structured mobility routines, even if it's just sitting in a chair and doing it, but taking it down to their level, because it's also going to help to decrease their loss of functional mobility, which in turn is going to increase their longevity
Right.
and decrease their risk of mobility, because in the older population and the very old population, the risks of opportunistic infections and disease processes happening when someone is immobile is very real and it's very high. So the more you can be mobile, you're going to reduce those risks of having those opportunistic infections and disease processes take hold of someone. So mobility does improve longevity. So if you practice that as a young individual through midlife and through adulthood and into your older age, you actually are helping yourself with like an anti-aging routine.
Awesome. So if we could go back a little bit to the mobility and stretching portion.
Mm-hmm.
So I've worked with people who are so, they're so like they may have done ballet. So they're able to do like, all these crazy, awesome things, like put their legs over here and all this other stuff, but it almost seems like it hinders them from actually being able to activate the muscles necessary to do what I'm asking them to do, such as do a loaded squat. Yeah, you can get all the way down to the ground and look great doing it, but now you don't know how to activate those muscles in order to stand back properly. How
Yeah.
common is that?
That's actually in dancers and in like ballet, they actually the New York City Ballet has actually set up, one of my instructors when I was in PT school worked with them, set up their own physical therapy practice because of the unique challenges that dancers and specifically ballet dancers have because of what you're exactly talking about. When you try to load them, they're not necessarily able to access that full range of motion and activate those muscles because of their increased flexibility. There's a lot of slack in their system. So every joint has a network of ligaments around it. It's a capsule.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the joint range of motion is limited by the capsule. And there's a capsular pattern in every joint that you should take up the slack first in this position, second in that position, and third. And it kind of goes down the line. And that creates normal, healthy motion. And there's limitations to help you keep that joint centered in the socket, so that you're getting proper movement and you're getting efficient movement without injuring the internal structures. So someone who's very highly flexible has this slack in their system. So as they start to move, and take the hip joint, for example, which is a highly mobile joint, if it starts to move and migrate a little bit too far forward, a little too high or low, your muscles and your nervous system, their main priority is for stability in every joint. So if you have excess mobility, they're going to try to prevent you from accessing deep into that range of motion because you don't have the strength, even though you've got the flexibility and the slack in the system to get there. But your body knows and senses it doesn't have that control to keep that joint stable. And that's paramount to the body, more so than movement, is having stability. So those individuals doing mobility work, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, they're already flexible, so why am I doing mobility work? For them, it's really important because the mobility work is a form of joint stabilization for them. It's teaching them that control, how to have their nervous system talk to the muscles, tendons, and other structures to coordinate the timing pattern to keep this joint moving in its correct ratio throughout the larger range of motion. But you very often will see someone who's really, like you said, highly mobile or can, really super flexible. You load them up in a movement like a squat, and they'll start hinging forward a lot. They'll sit a lot just to try to either lock the hips into a stable position or to limit their range of motion at one joint so that they can take over with a stronger joint, and it's no longer this nice coordinated movement throughout the body. So it is fairly common that you do see someone, especially see it more in the female population because men typically are just tighter. But you have some guys, some kids that were, a low tone child growing up might have that slack in their system. And if you have, like we said, that too much slack, your nervous system starts to get nervous that the joint's going to be compromised. So as you start moving through a range of motion and it feels that you don't have the strength in that range of motion, it's going to stop you. And it's not going to let you access it. So that's why it's really important to work on with an individual like that. Is the mobility work is not only preparing them for the exercise, but it's really retraining neuromuscular re-educating their nervous system to control that movement and access the strength that they can within that range of motion.
Awesome. Thanks for going through that, very thoroughly. I didn't want to take away from the next portion. I was a little worried you might spill into it. So where does the mobility work fit in?
Right.
So as far as training, in general.
Yeah. So typically it should be done at the beginning of the workout. So either the beginning of the workout, prior to practice, prior to a competition, or you can have your own separate mobility day if there's an area where you're really just, kind of stuck on. So just to give people an idea of like what I'm talking about with mobility, if you could just show them the video of the toe swipes, which is a very basic standard mobility video or mobility movement. So what I'm doing here is I'm stretching my hamstring but I'm not staying in that position for very long. I'm going down, reaching down, stretching my hamstring, and then I'm using my hamstring to raise me back up. And I'm keeping my arms long to increase the load on the muscle a little bit so that I'm preparing that muscle to realize that I want it to lengthen and stretch. And when it gets to the end range, my body and nervous system are ready and they know that I should contract to come back up. So that muscle knows like, all right, when these hamstrings are working, if it gets too far, you got to be ready to bring it back. Right? So as I said, putting it prior to a workout, prior to practice, competition is going to be really where it's going to be most benefited because it's going to help you prepare your muscles for what you're going to be engaging in to prevent you from injuring yourself and just so your body's prepared. So it's basically telling your body that this is the movement that we're going to do, and you're required to lengthen under tension, maintain that tension as we're lengthening to protect the joint, but also keep that joint in a good stable position as we move back. Right? And in that video there, that was mainly for the hamstring. So you're working the control around your hip joint and your knee, but we're incorporating the whole body with it. So how your spine, pelvis also interact with each other and your hips and your lower extremities. So it really just helps to coordinate all that movement. If you just did a hamstring stretch, we're missing on a lot of those elements. And it's really an opportunity that's being missed that can prevent an injury potentially from happening and helping your nervous system grow. Because mobility will help you see better gains in whether it's when you're lifting or in a performance of an athlete or a dancer, anything like that.
Awesome. And so you kind of touched briefly on it, or at least you started to. So where exactly does mobility fit if we were to compare it against stretching, especially on some of the lifts, like getting into the proper depth when you're doing a squat, or knowing knowing how to properly engage your hips so that you can actually execute the deadlift, and when you're doing things like the bench press? Where do those different factors play?
So the big thing, if we look at like stretching, So what does stretching do? Because this will tie into like exactly what you're talking about. So stretching is gonna lengthen the tissues. It's gonna lengthen your muscles, your tendons. It's also gonna lengthen your ligaments. Even though your ligaments are a static structure, they should have a defined length. But if someone has an injury and the joint has been immobilized for a while, the ligaments are going to tighten up. So stretching will help them to gain their length and their flexibility back, because you got to have a certain length in your ligaments to allow the what they call accessory movements of a joint, enough slack in the system to perform a full range of motion. So that's what stretching is going to do. It's going to lengthen the muscles, the ligaments, the tendons, and it's also going to lengthen your nerves and your nerves' ability to slide through the muscles and through the adjacent structures. So what does stretching do? It does those things by quieting your nervous system. It turns your nervous system off slightly, and it quiets your stretch reflex and your deep tendon reflex. So like when you go to the doctor and the doctor, hits your knee with the hammer and your leg jumps. That's an example of a deep tendon reflex or a stretch reflex. What he's doing is introducing a quick stretch on the tendon, which stretches the muscle, and your nervous system reflexively contracts. And that's a healthy response. So when we're stretching, that resistance that you feel initially is your body fighting that stretch. So when you hold a static stretch, you're teaching your body to relax and quiet that reflex down. So like we talked about before, how mobility is preparing you for activity and preparing you to lift and get your hips ready for a deadlift, hips ready for a squat, your trunk ready for a squat, your chest, shoulders, and back for a bench or any pushing or pulling. You don't want those muscles to learn or be trained right before you do that to go to full length and quiet, because that's when you're going to get injured. Right. So if you're trying to squat and you're putting a tremendous amount of stretch throughout your glutes on the bottom, and you just stretch your glutes out for 15 minutes before you squatted, when they get down there, your nervous system is going to relax a little bit. Even though you're under a load, it's going to relax a little bit, and it's not going to be there to lift you up. So if your glutes aren't firing, then your hamstrings are going to fire to try to compensate for that. And so that glute hip or glute hamstring timing pattern is thrown off. And in that example, what happens is when your glutes don't fire first or effectively enough, when you're trying to perform hip extension, whether it's running, squatting, deadlifting, and your hamstrings fire first, because of where your hamstring asserts on your pelvis, it's actually going to push the ball, the femoral head, the ball forward in the socket, which is going to destabilize you. And it's going to tighten up your hip flexors. You're going to pitch forward, and it's going to probably your back is going to get overworked, and you might strain a hamstring. All right, so that's why mobility prepares those those structures in your body to get under the bar, to go for a run. So in that scenario where you've got someone who's got a lot of slack and they're down there and they're used to stretching a lot, they're really exposing themselves because they've quieted this muscle down, or they taught their muscle right before activity to, when I lengthen you, relax and let it stretch. But what the activity you're about to engage in doesn't require that. It requires the opposite. It requires you to lengthen with a good amount of tension, get to a point of stability, and then contract back. So that's where a lot of injuries occur. Is like if someone rolls an ankle or a non-contact ACL type injury, the joint started to move too far, and that stretch reflex wasn't there. That little the same input that the doctor's hitting you with a little hammer is not there when your muscle stretches on an athletic field to come back, and it allows the joint to go a little bit too far, tears an ACL, tears a deltoid ligament of the ankle, strains the ligament. So that's where the mobility is what you want to engage in prior to an exercise or an activity. It's retraining your body to do what it needs to do for what are you going to ask it to do when you compete or when you exercise. Now, stretching is still important though. So it's not, sounds like I'm bad mouthing stretching. So stretching, and I hope I'm not going away from your question so far.
No, you're good.
Stretching is more of a like a recovery tool. And it, like we said, it is important. You need to be flexible in order to have good mobility, right? But being flexible doesn't mean you have good mobility. It's kind of like that message. But stretching is important, and it's more of, like I said, a recovery tool, because after you work out, you exercise, or you had a long day at work, we're holding our bodies up against gravity. So there are muscles that are working constantly. So without us being truly aware of it, we're going to be overworking one group of muscles more than another, most likely. And so when you stretch, it's a good idea to stretch after you exercise, or after a long day, or after a competition, because when the muscle gets fatigued, it's going to want to tighten up to recover. So if it doesn't get that chance to recover and it doesn't regain its length, that's an area that's going to be probably your future injury, an area of future injury. So the stretching allows you to become aware of where the tight areas are, where the restrictions are, and those areas that have tightened up to recover, there's an overactive nervous system component going on there. And it's just kind of a feedback loop. The nerve at the muscle level goes to the spine and right back. We're not conscious of it. So we can't just kind of like let it go, consciously think to let it go. You can try to consciously relax, and let a muscle stretch. But that area that's overworked, it's a spinal reflex. It's just kind of going back and forth. So why stretching will be helpful is because we said it kind of quiets your nervous system. So if you got that reflex going that's keeping an area really tight and bunched up, that'll allow it to relax, turn that nervous system off, get the length back in those tissues, so that the next time you go to do your mobility work, you're now retraining those tissues again to lengthen and shorten, versus it just staying tight and shortened after the competition.
Awesome. So when we compare the two concepts of mobility and stretching, how important are they to someone having good range of motion when they're trying to execute a movement pattern?
I mean, they're crucial, super important. So you have to have, like I said, you have to have the flexibility, or the available range of motion to execute that movement. So that's going to require you to stretch, right? So you don't necessarily only have to stretch after you work out. Like we said, you could take stretching at a completely separate time. You just do that static stretching before you're going to compete, or before you're going to engage in a coordinated movement. So you're going to need that flexibility. So you got to stretch. And then once you have that prerequisite range of motion, then the mobility is going to allow your body to have control around there. So it's going to allow you to accomplish that lift with keeping your joints in a stable, congruent position, which leads to healthy joints, healthy tissues, and injury-free. So they really go hand in hand. But I guess the take-home message is, just because you're flexible doesn't mean that you're actually mobile. You don't. It's not. So just being flexible is not going to help you accomplish and execute that lift, because you might not have the control in the deeper portion of the lift or the movement that you're asking your client to do. So that's where you got to make sure that they have that mobility aspect. So if you go to the video of the gentleman with the chains, this is a mobility exercise for hip rotation, hip mobility. And because I want him to have some strength in that range of motion, I loaded him with the chains. That's like 40 pounds of chains. And so this particular athlete, he's a baseball pitcher. He's predicted to be a top 10 draft pick for the next major league draft. So hip mobility is huge for him, but he was having an issue where he was having a little bit of some control issues around the hips. So I did a lot of mobility work with him under tension. So not just doing his squats, we got him really strong with his squats, but squats are very linear. There's not that component and larger range of motion movement component and the lateral aspect, which he really needs as well. So when we would do our mobility work, I would often load him under some tension while he's doing that mobility work. And that could be an exercise in and of itself for someone who has hip instability. That's kind of like, in an advanced stage of their programming to load them. So that could be an exercise, standalone exercise. But for someone like him, that's part of his mobility routine. And we would really, maybe he would come a half hour early before our sessions just to do his mobility work, so that we were ready to go, because he would do so much mobility, because pitching is such a highly coordinated movement that, any instability around one joint is going to there's so many variables, it's going to throw the whole movement off, and he's not going to have the control. And that's really what sets him apart, is his control. So we want to really foster that. So, so having, using your training hat and mindset, you want to try to mimic and think about, okay, this person's mobile, but we're still seeing they have some decent mobility, but still their squat, we're seeing that they're not getting to that level, that depth. Let's try to challenge not only the linear movement, let's challenge some rotational movements under load too, in a mobility setting where there's less chance of injuring. So we're going to put some load on, but not a whole lot of load, and a load that they can maneuver with. A bar kind of locks you into a degree, but way less than a machine, obviously. But it's just kind of like you're looking at different levels and you're trying to dissect what an individual needs.
That's awesome. So I noticed some of this, I don't get the opportunity to work with, world-class athletes, but working with, regular people when they come in for their assessment and we're, just starting, and I have them do their squat. And you're able to notice, the squat is a very good tell of, instability. You can see the knees caving in, the hips doing something awkward. And it's just interesting to me, like every time you see it, and in their minds, they're doing it perfectly.
Right.
Like, something's not right there.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that, like, using that, it's so great to use that as an assessment tool, and you're really like dissecting it, because that can really help you tailor your mobility work with someone to try to address some of those issues. If their knees are caving in, you want to do some mobility work that challenges lateral movements while keeping alignment. And, so if you just doing body weight work under the guise of mobility, you're really going to be able to affect change. And then they're going to see it, they might kind of think like, oh, this is just like warm ups. Why do I need to really, spend the time and focus so much? But then when they see that translate to an improved squat, and they might not notice that their knees are caving in, but they start to notice that, this weight is getting lighter, and I can move more, and I just feel more power, more strength, more stability, like feel more connected. Then they'll start to, you kind of take them back. Oh, remember those mobility exercises? That's why you're doing this. And then they start to buy into it more. And, because really results are what keep people interested.
Right. I mean, it's instant. It's interesting in general, when you're able to say this is where we are, and you're able to pull them back in time. Like, hey, so this is why we had to, make sure our knees were locked up this way, make sure we have proper movement in our hips and things where, tilting the proper way when we're talking about the pelvic area and all those other things. It's just very interesting. We're able to actually see them not only do it, but believe and feel confident in the movements because you put in that leg work so many times beforehand.
Right. And there's another thing just to kind of, I guess, drive home the effects of stretching and why you don't want to do static stretching before you work out, because a lot of people grew up doing that, and they see, they watch an NBA game, and you see guys out on the floor and the trainers are stretching them. One, they're not stretching them for very long, and they've gone through a whole host of other warm-ups, and they're just, most likely those, you just see a handful of guys doing that, and they're probably stretching out an area that was injured. So that area needs a little bit of quieting down. But there is a lot of studies that are done to look at the effects of static stretching on performance. And there's one that was done at the University of Miami at Ohio that looked at static stretching with collegiate track and field athletes. So it took a handful of sprinters, and it put them through got them warmed up, and two groups on two separate days. One group did a static stretch. The other one just did the dynamic warm up and no stretching. So they both did a dynamic warm up beforehand. One did a static stretching, one didn't. And then they did a 20-meter sprint, 40-meter, 60-meter, 100-meter sprint. And then the next day they flipped. The groups flipped on what they did. And what it showed was that there was a statistically significant reduction in speed over 20 meters. So everybody's 20-meter time who did static stretching was slower than the time that did it without stretching. Now, when you got past 20 meters, their speed didn't continue to drop, but their overall speed was slower because their first 20 was slower. That response from the start and the movement and their dynamic overcoming static ability really dropped. And if they didn't re-engage in a dynamic movement, that drop in time actually carried over for almost 24 hours. So dynamic warm-up really does, the mobility work and dynamic warm-up really does prepare your nervous system and your muscles for movement. And like that, when I heard about studies like that and read studies like that, it really kind of like really impressed upon me. And at one point I was like, why am I even stretching? But then, I realized, like, oh, I need that for the recovery. I got to do that. So if I do the stretch, because my fear was, I stretch after I compete, because I was an athlete at the time, track and field. And I'm like, if I stretch and I can compete after I compete, then the next day I've taken myself down a notch. But if you go back and do the mobility, you rev that engine back up, you retrain your nervous system, and it's right back there for you. It's ready and prepared.
That's awesome. That is interesting. Like I remember being in the Marine Corps, and like we'd have different people lead us on PT from time to time. You'd have one leader who would say, we got to do, they didn't call it static stretch, and they probably didn't know that's what it was called, but they'd have us do this before the run. And then we'd have other leaders who were like, we're just going to warm up on the run. So we just take off at a light jog, and then we pick up speed as we went. Yeah. And I noticed, like, when we did the static stretching beforehand, I felt extremely exhausted right off the bat. Like I just felt like I wasn't into it. Versus when we took off and we just started running. Granted, I hated the fact that I knew that was going to happen. Right. My performance was better. So
yeah. So I mean, right there, real world experience. It tells it all.
We have Natasha. She said, very interesting about the static stretching before working out. I assumed it was a must before a workout.
Yeah, it's a misconception, and it was something that we were probably all taught when we were younger. Make sure you stretch before you work out. Make sure you stretch, because you do want to have, the thought process was, make sure that there's good blood flow in the muscles. Make sure that everything is loose and ready to go. But, after realizing that, what's happening on a physiologic level, that we're, lulling that nervous system to sleep when we stretch, you start to realize that's counterproductive. So there was a time, I think it's got to be like, I think it was like the late 80s, when like USA Track and Field just basically said that we are not stretching before workouts anymore. We are just doing dynamic warm-ups, kind of like what you talked about with your Marine days. You go and you start with a run. Then you do they were incorporating plyometrics, which have their benefit in their place, but there are also risks of some injuries with that too if you're not doing it properly. But so they just started incorporating and tried to figure out what a good dynamic warm-up would be to really get the nervous system ready to go. And they had released a statistic at one point that in that first year of stopping static stretching before practices and competitions, the incidence of Achilles tendon ruptures, Achilles tendonitis, calf strains, hamstring pulls went down by like 70%, something like that. It was like some fun, like crazy number. And it was this new conditioning coach that came in and was like, look, this is what the research has been showing us. I know we've been doing this for a long time, but this is, this is what we're going to do because we're having too many people getting injured.
Awesome. We have Michael here. He says, I'm in my late 40s. I'm a male. I work on mobility often in the gym with my strengthening exercises. Are there some foods/supplements, vitamins to help assist the system in increasing mobility? Maybe something to help the joints move more freely or joint nutrients?
So right off the bat, hydration, and it sounds like an obvious one, but if you're well hydrated, you have just a lot more elasticity in your muscles and your tendons. When your tendons, ligaments, and muscles are hydrated, they're mobile, they are not brittle. You can think of your muscles and tendons like taffy. If you took taffy out of a box and you try to stretch it, it snaps. But if you warm it up and knead it, it becomes more pliable. So hydration helps with that. Same thing with the sponge. If you took a sponge that's really dry, you're going to crease it and kind of crack it as you move it. But when it's moist and hydrated, it's going to be really supple and move and return to its shape. So that's first and foremost, easiest thing to do is to be hydrated going into a workout and make sure you're rehydrating at the end of a workout. Then other things, having healthy fats in your diet, essential fatty acids, omega-3s are really important, 6 and 9s as well, but we get a lot of 6 and 9s in our diets and less so of the omega-3s. So our bodies typically, if we're not supplementing with essential fatty acids, we're probably have an abundance of omega-6s and 9s in our body. And our cells, every cell in your body has that lipid layer around it, the fat layer around it that helps transporting nutrients in and waste products out. And your muscle cells, nerve cells, tendon, ligament cells are all kind of the same way. They need to have that healthy fats around their structure to function properly. And that's going to allow them to be more elastic and recover. So those two things would be the first things that I would say. Then for joint, like you hear frequently glucosamine and chondroitin. Those are elements of the matrix that makes up some of the cartilage of your joints, both like the meniscus cartilage or the hyaline, the really smooth cartilage at the end of the bone. So those, if they're well nourished with those nutrients, you're going to get good gliding, good mobility, and good elasticity of those structures as well, because they need to be, recycling themselves and mobile and moving. There are others, collagen supplements keep the elasticity. Protein in general really helps with, muscle recovery, muscle repair. So that also helps with that elasticity of the muscles. The biggest thing I would say would be hydration is the number one thing that's really going to help somebody. If you're really hydrated, you're going to notice a difference in your mobility. Other supplements, like I said, the essential fatty acids, glucosamine, chondroitin, collagen, those are other things, but it's kind of like those are much smaller factors in the process. If you're not hydrated and you don't have good cellular health, the other things are not really going to make that much of an impact.
Right. It's interesting you say that, because I've noticed over the last year or so, like everyone's pushing collagen, like protein. That's the big thing, like collagen, protein. They're pushing it, but they're not talking about the other things you could do that you don't have to go pay out of pocket for. Just
right.
Get some extra water,
For water, absolutely. And if you eat more avocados, you get your healthy fats in there, olive oil, walnuts, certain nuts. You could get a fish oil, or you could get a nut and seed based oil that has omega-3, 6, and 9s in there too. And that's going to help the elasticity and the just the dynamic structures of your body tremendously.
Also really like the taffy analogy. I haven't heard that one before. Michael said, excellent, thank you. What are a couple of normal trouble areas that are stubborn or maybe more hidden that usually need more mobility training?
I would definitely say the hips, especially for men. You know, especially if you're going to try to squat, deadlift. Hip mobility is a big area where people often don't realize how limited they are, because the ability to internally and externally rotate your hip, not that you're going to necessarily could be doing that motion when you're doing a lot of the lifts in the gym, but your body has to have a certain amount of slack in the system, like we said, in order to full movements. And kind of an easier way to illustrate that is, you know, your fingers, they bend and straighten. That's what they do. But if you passively take your finger, you can rotate it side to side along the long axis because it has that ligamentous slack. If you didn't have that slack to be able to do that, you wouldn't be able to fully bend or fully straighten your fingers. So if you just kind of think of that with every joint of your body, you have to have those accessory motions there in order to accomplish full range of motion. Otherwise, you're going to compensate somewhere else. You'll compensate at the knees, at the low back, at the pelvis. So the biggest things I think about, you know, in terms of mobility, always start around the hips, then in your pelvis and low back. Your back's ability to kind of curve in to lordosis, you know, arch in, or to bow out and be flexible when you curl forward. And so your spine's ability to flex over your pelvis, and your pelvis's ability to flex and extend below your spine will impact your hips, and vice versa. If your hips aren't mobile, you're going to have back issues. If your back is really stiff, you're going to overuse your hips. And at some point, one of them is going to break down. Usually the back will break down first because it's a bunch of small joints and small muscles. Your hips, large joint, large muscle. Majority, 90% of all of our movement should stem from that, even rotationally. It's once you get to the end range of your hips that you use your spine to fine tune the movement. So if you've got a lot of mobility in your hips, you don't have to overuse your spine. If you're rotating and you get to that end range really quickly because you don't have that slack in the system, then your spine's going to overtake and it's just going to wear down much quicker. So I would definitely say that the biggest overlooked thing would be the rotational movements of the hips and then the lumbar mobility.
It's awesome that you say that. I was just at a class I was hosting this past weekend, and I was working with a gentleman because I noticed he was doing what we were about to do. We were about to do, I think, deadlifts. Mm-hmm. I noticed he wasn't able to use his pelvic the right way. Like I noticed it was just all wrong. And I'm like, yep, yeah, you're not even touching the bar. We're just going to make a movement while everyone else goes ahead. But one of the things I suggested to him, I'm about to butcher the name of it, but I suggested that he does the cat-cow. Yeah. Just so he can get used to that movement and knowing what it's like to actually get things working the right way.
And he probably, if you talk to him, and he might have even said this, he probably has a history of some back issues. Because very often when you have back pain, that pain starts to inhibit those muscles from working. So his proprioception, his ability to even realize that he's not in that good neutral position when he's bending forward in the deadlift, he probably couldn't even feel that he wasn't. And it's almost banging your head against the wall, like, no, get it into that straight position. And he's kind of like, I don't know, which way do I do it? You just do that perceptive input when you have chronic injuries around an area. So reducing the degrees of freedom, when you're ready to deadlift, there's so many variables: your upper body, your lower body, you're holding the weight position, is it drifting too far, things like that. So if you reduce the variables, get them on the hands and knees and just move the pelvis and lumbar spine, then he can focus that area and relearn it. And then you do it in kneeling, have him doing kneeling, and then stand up and do it, and then bend forward and do it, and go through that whole mobility cascade.
Right. Michael got back to us. He said, thank you. Yes, makes perfect sense. Squats are my Achilles heel. I'll be sure to work on that more. Very stiff lower back for me. Slip disc 8 years ago.
Okay, there you go. So if you can really increase the mobility of your hips, that's going to help your squat tremendously. The other thing I would say with squats, ankle mobility. If you don't have good ankle mobility and you can't, so when you're squatting, if this is your lower leg and this is your foot, your shin should start to come forward so that your knees start to go towards your toes. And a lot of people think like your knees, you don't want your knees going over your toes. It's not really true. You do want your knees to migrate forward. You do want to have that positive shin angle, that your shin and your knees are moving towards the front of your toes to get your body above you aligned so you're not overstressing your low back and your pelvis. So if you really want to try to do a lot of ankle mobility work, because you might have good flexibility, but if you don't have the strength to control that, your shin's going to stop. Now your butt's going to stick back and you're going to collapse forward with your upper body. Now your shoulders are way in front of your hips, and the line of stress is going to be the low back.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why some guys you'll see, like a lot of Olympic lifters, CrossFit guys will use those squat shoes that have like a wedge heel on them. So that the heel that their, heel is higher than their foot. By doing that, that already throws you into that positive shin angle, so you don't have to worry about that loss of mobility around the ankle as much. So that's a way to compensate for it. But ideally, you'd want to try to gain that mobility first.
Awesome. All right. Let's see. I think you had one more video for us.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I'm pretty curious about this one. So I was pretty curious about this one.
This was just, I was going to use it when you said, when to do it or who should be doing it. So this is just an example because the other two examples were lower body mobility work. So these are called Y cuffs. You're forward in the forward position. It's like a Y with your body. And then you're bringing your hands behind you like you're being handcuffed. So what I'm doing is rotating my thumbs down, pulling my shoulder blades down towards my feet as I bring my arms around back. So you're working a lot of elements of shoulder mobility: flexion, extension, internal rotation, external rotation, scapular depression, scapular retraction. So it seems like a very simple thing. It's a complex movement. It's actually pretty fatiguing. I'll use it with some of my shoulder rehab patients, but doing that really warms up the posterior aspect of your shoulders, the muscle, the neuromuscular control aspect of the posterior aspect of the shoulders, the deltoids, scapular stabilizers, and the rotator cuff. So that whole posterior component of the shoulder girdle is so important for any pressing exercise, pulling, or overhead pressing. Without that, you're going to lose that control of the glenohumeral joint, the shoulder joint. So the ball is going to move around in the socket and try to find a stable place, which if it's not active in the back, your muscles in the front of your body, like your strong pecs and shoulders, are going to pull it forward and try to lock it forward. And that's going to lead to posterior shoulder pain, internal impingements, rotator cuff impingements. So an exercise like that is something you really want to do to prep your upper body, even if you're doing pressing activity, even more so if you're doing pressing activities, because the pulling activities are going to get them active inherently. But your pushing motion, you could be super strong in the front, but you're going to be limited on how much you can move forward by how much your back can stabilize that movement. That's why powerlifters tend to have really huge broad backs and do a lot of back supplemental exercises for their bench. But just for shoulder health in general and good posture, especially if you're sitting at your desk a lot. Someone, we're talking about with this in this environment that you're sitting at your desk, you're sitting at home and you're in a poor sitting workstation, you're slouching. An exercise like the Y cuffs is really great because you're extended. You're training the muscles of your spine to be stabilizers and training the muscles of the shoulder blade to be stabilizers, while the shoulder joint, the rotator cuff muscles, deltoids, they're the ones accomplishing the movement. You need that mobility imposed upon that stability for healthy movement. If you don't have that, things break down. And in the shoulder girdle, that's the biggest thing that causes problem. scapular stabilizers and the spine stabilizers don't provide that stability for the mobility to occur. So the moving muscles that should be just worrying about movement are now trying to do both, and they can't. And then you start to get wear and tear.
Awesome. That's definitely going inside the toolbox. All right, so we got Michael. He says, is there a place online where I can watch those movements you're showing to work on them?
Yes. So on my Instagram page, which is at Vitale_T, the letter T, like training 2. So yeah, there we go. Right there. It's on the screen. So I have on my page there, if you look back, there's a number of mobility routines there. There's some specific for the shoulder, some specific for the lower body. There's a couple of on the Instagram TV links on my page. There are a couple of like full, like 20-30 minute full body mobility routines. So there's a lot of information about mobility on my Instagram page.
Awesome. All right. And before we get out of here, as usual, I like to ask, do you have any words of wisdom to pass on to the people that are watching?
I would just say consistency. With whatever you're doing, if you're consistent, you're going to see results. So if you're noticing that your mobility is lacking, just, really spend the time, be consistent. You're going to see the cumulative results of that consistency. That's the biggest thing that I try to impart on anybody that I work with, that if you just try to go into it, I'll just do mobility once a week, or I'll just do it here, or I'm only going to do it when I see you, not really going to get to the goals that you're looking to get to. And it's just with anything in life. If you're consistent, you're dedicated, and you're focused on the task at hand, you're going to see the results.
I like that a lot. We got one more thing. Mr. Michael, he said, thank you very much. Can you do too much mobility training?
You can, because if, for instance, the pitcher in the picture with the chains, he, really wanted to work on his hip mobility. And there were times where he would spend, like I said, he would come in early and do about a half hour of mobility before we worked out. And on his off days, he would come in sometimes and say, yeah, I did about like an hour and a half of mobility. And you would notice that next day when we were working out, he wasn't moving that well, because his joints were a little sore, a little achy. He had just put too much stress on the ligaments, and there was just a little bit of an ache there. So you can overdo anything that's good. So I would, I wouldn't spend more than a half hour on mobility, and I wouldn't spend more than, with more than about like 20 to 30 reps would be maximum on a movement for mobility. And the other element that I'm thinking about now that goes along with mobility, we said you need to be flexible. And at one point I said one of the components of mobility is that your tissues have that flexibility and mobility. We talked about if you had a scar or you had an injury and there's adhesions, those areas you'd want to also do some self-myofascial work, like rolling, doing some foam rolling on an area that is you've identified as being restricted, very tight, that's not improving with just stretching. So you want to do some foam rolling to try to reduce those areas of restriction. That would be the only other thing that I would add into this conversation.
Okay. We got Natasha. She said this had fantastic information. Thank you both.
You're very welcome.
And Jeff, he wishes you were here. All right, awesome.
I do virtual sessions. So if anybody wants to, at any time to have a virtual session, you can contact me, direct message me through Instagram, and we can set up a virtual session just to kind of, if there's anything specific you wanted to address in terms of mobility, or if you had an injury, questions about your injuries.
Awesome. So you heard it, guys. Don't be afraid to hit Jeff up. I can say personally from my own experience, he's a great guy, like awesome dude, very, personable and just interesting, full of knowledge. So I want to thank you for coming on the show, man. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, I loved it. I appreciate you asking.
Oh yeah, of course, of course. And yeah, that's going to do it for us tonight. If we have no more questions, I'll definitely make sure to pass on any questions I find out about, through Instagram to you, so you'll know who to contact and whatnot.
Great. All right.
All right, you guys take it easy, and thank you guys so much for tuning in tonight. Thank you for being here. Thank you for everything you do, and as always, keep pushing. Your greatness awaits.